Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me out there in the ether. Welcome to our very first Inklusiiv Breakfast Club. Frantic is proud to be one of Inklusiiv's partners and honored to be kicking off this series of talks. It's really lovely to see so many of you already online, and I think there's probably a few coming still, but we're at a really nice number already. First thing in the morning at 8 o'clock on, when I look out my window right now, it's rather gray. So we're honored to be partners with Inklusiiv and kicking off this series of talks. My name is Lisa Benmergi, and I'm currently the service design lead at Frantic, and I will be taking on the role of host today. So grab that first or maybe second cup of coffee. I'm going to close this door. I just noticed that's in behind me. So that I don't bother the rest of the people around me. Yeah. So yeah, get that coffee or tea and get comfy wherever you may be. And we would have loved to have you all here in person with us at the office, but we're going to be embracing the fact that we can open this event up to a wider range of people without the constraints of geography. Today we have a great lineup of lightning talks around the topic of inclusivity and digital service design, as well as a Q&A session afterwards with the speakers and myself. So please feel free, if you haven't already gotten acquainted with the Zoom interface, if it is your first time or your 50th Zoom, there's a Q&A button probably somewhere around the bottom of your application. If you're on the mobile, it's also there. So just throw in any questions you have for the speakers, and we'll get to those at the end of the session after the talks, as well as we have a moderator today, Tytti Pöysti, one of Frantic's talented agile coaches and project leads, and she'll be our chat moderator today. So she's online there. So if you have any comments or questions, you can throw them in there as well. Let's see, a few last housekeeping notes. Heads up, we are indeed recording this session. We will share the recording with you all via email along with a feedback form afterwards. And you'll probably see the Inklusiiv hashtag. I'm just going to look over at yes, it's there. The Inklusiiv hashtag and our Twitter handle, frantic.com, at the bottom of our slides. So if you're an avid Twitter user, tag us in your tweets and we'll be retweeting those. Now I'm just going to check that we have Bikash online, yes, and I'm gonna just make sure that he is able to speak. Bikash Gurung is from Inklusiiv, and I would love to, before we introduce the topics and speakers, I'd love to have Bikash online and speaking a little bit about Inklusiiv.
Thank you, Lisa. And a pleasure to be here, and wonderful to see so many of you joining us this Thursday morning. So my name is Bikash, and I'm heading projects and events at Inklusiiv. We are a nonprofit with a mission to advance diversity and inclusion in working life. So in our community, what we do is we share knowledge and best practices, organize events, and carry out different projects and campaigns on diversity and inclusion. So overall, our community activities consist of two parts: creating various projects, activities, and campaigns that support the making of working life more diverse and inclusive. And the other one is building a community for organizations and companies, and that sort of help them to learn and implement best D&I practices in workplaces. And that's how we have ended up creating our Inklusiiv Breakfast Club, which is organized by Inklusiiv Supporting Members, for instance, today by Frantic. So the whole idea is to use this morning breakfast hour to kind of like shake up the way we think and the way we do things, especially that is related to diversity and inclusion, and also to spark some kind of engaging discussions or conversations around it. This is the very first of the Breakfast Club series that we are organizing, and I'm really looking forward to learn something new. So thank you to the whole Frantic team for putting the event together. And on behalf of Inklusiiv, hope you all enjoy this event and have a wonderful rest of the week. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Vikash. And well, yeah, let's get our show on the road. I'm just going to go forward in our slides here. Yep. And let's see. Yes, sorry. I just lost myself in my slide setup here. Yeah, so thanks so much, Vikash, for that introduction. And now we'll go on. I'll just say a few words, a little bit about our topic today. And I will start off with what inclusive design, the idea and the mindset. And I think that some words that when I read these words, these were very powerful words to me. And the lines that it is normal to be different and it is abnormal to be indifferent are two very bold statements that I would like you to think about throughout the talks today. Inclusive design is about considering humans and their permanent as well as temporary situations. It's about being aware that every design decision that we make has potential to exclude someone. So therefore, we have to be thinking not just inclusively, but considering the gamut of people. Now, segmenting a population using the triangle puts abilities into perspective. Now, this is just a quick overview, and we'll be going on to the other topics in a moment. But it's one thing to think about people by their abilities, and the base is usually that there are no difficulties, and then there's minimal difficulties. Then we move on to mild as well, then to severe. When we're looking at this, it's not always possible to design one product to address the needs of the entire population. But what we think with inclusive design is that we want to be taking into account the diversity in the population by developing products that provide the best coverage for the population, ensure that each individual a product has a clear and distinct target users, as well as reduce the level of ability. So make things as easy as possible so you improve the user experience for a broad range of customers in a variety of situations. Now, when we look at inclusive design, the target for the inclusive design actually is not just this lower base, but quite a large amount of this triangle. And the target for specialist products is only at the very, very tip. And that's when you need assistive devices. But we're trying to think outside of the fact that we don't want to push people into a box that, okay, there's the able-bodied and disabled. We want to also open up the fact that the population diversity extends to more than just abilities. And it's first and foremost from universal design that you could think about things in a physical way and see abled and disabled persons. But you could further broaden and consider diversity associated with different real world contexts, lifestyle, aspirations, gender, and past experiences. So I just want to leave you with a few questions before we start the talks, is how do we know we are being inclusive if we are not aware of who or what we may be excluding? And how can we be objective or try to be if we don't confront the unconscious biases that lurk within ourselves? And how can we be fair and just if we are not considering every word we use and how it can draw a line between us and them? These are the questions we'll be delving into today. And the last point here is that inclusive design is about simultaneously designing for the personal experience and the universal experience. It's not going to be easy, and we don't think that they will be. But these are the ideas that are swirling around in our heads and will be talked about by the speakers today. Now, I'm going to be introducing our first talk by Michal Dlugosch, and he is Frantic strategy director. He's been working as a strategist and designer for years, and he focuses on people's motivations and needs beyond clear-cut use cases. Michal's background is in communication and psychology, so it is no surprise that he has developed a keen interest in behavioral sciences in recent years. Now, Michal's talk it reverses things, and he will be actually looking at the mechanics of exclusion and how it can be used to produce better designs, better design results for everyone. Now, I hope that I see that Michal's online there, yes? And I'm going to mute and stop my video and stop sharing and allow Michal to share his screen. Take it away, Michal.
So, good morning from my behalf as well. I hope you can see me and you can see the slides I'm meaning to present here. As Lisa said before, I will be talking about inclusivity problems and how to reframe them. As a general notion, I'm a design generalist, so I'm not a trained designer, but over the past 20 years, I have put a huge focus on how people make sense of the world around them. And I believe that this is a valid starting point for what we're talking about today. Any design, as we know, starts with a prompt, draw a distinction. And out of all possible reasons that we could have for example, for creating a new social network, which one do we consider most important? Are we doing it for fun? Are we doing it for profit? Are we doing it for avoiding insolvency or because we are bored with other social networks out there? As designers, we always are using distinctions, and we use sequences of distinctions to shape our designs. Now, this means that our initial designs are very likely to be exclusive at some point. So we start designing to solve one particular problem and not many at a time. And then we develop our designs further in order to solve another problem and another problem and another. The point is that we don't stop there. As we all know, design is not a linear process with a fixed endpoint. The process of designing uses two mechanics, exploration and limitation. Over time, the artifacts we are creating become more solid, but they also change how we look at the world. This means that the learnings we draw from designing until now are always influencing the way we continue designing. This whole phenomenon is called recursion. We are designing our way of designing. And inclusive design is using the precise mechanic like this to manifest itself. The point is that we don't stop there. We know that every designer has hypothetical and actual people, user personas, and personality traits in their mind when designing. And no surprise, a designer's mind may contain people that are not unlike the designer, him or herself. In fact, we can only design for what we can imagine, and personas can help us to broaden our imagination, but so can talking to real people. When we think about inclusive design, we often think about overcoming impairments that limit people partaking in an experience. Commonly, we think of persistent impairments that come easily to mind, like a person in a wheelchair, or somebody who is colorblind, or a person who can't see at all. But it is worth keeping in mind that not all impairments are of permanent nature. Most of you probably are familiar with the work that Kat Holmes did at Microsoft. In her recent book, Mismatch, she's reflecting on how the design process changes when it aims at being more inclusive. Now, this spectrum idea has an interesting implication. We need to use a rather broad perspective on what is exclusive and what is inclusive. And honestly, I absolutely love this chart. A parent with a newborn may only be able to use one hand at a time. So yes, it's an impairment, although a situational one. And look at the person at the bottom right, a person with a heavy accent depicted as a female Viking warrior. I think it's brilliant. Is it discrimination? No, I think it's distinction. Well, take a look at the following photo of a situationally impaired person. We probably wouldn't describe this woman in the picture as being handicapped. She may be seen as extremely busy, as being under stress, or as very much focused on the task right ahead of her. But now imagine her to receive a call from an unknown caller at this very moment. And that caller, it turns out, is trying to convince her to sign up for a newspaper subscription in her local hometown. What do you think is the chance of the sales agent succeeding with this task in this situation? It cannot be overemphasized. Being stressed or distracted hinders people from getting on board with an experience. And this woman surely has better things to do than to subscribe to a newspaper right now. But when we are framing our design problems only with regard to people's demographics or their ambitions in life or their gender or sexual orientation, we will probably get it wrong. Now, I could easily imagine that recognizing this specific situation of the woman in the picture could lead to future call center questions, call center scripts containing a line with the question, am I calling at a bad time? Now, what do you imagine the closing rates for a call center agent using this question would be? But on the other hand, think about the satisfaction rates amongst those that are being called. So what is more important? Is it customer satisfaction or closing a deal? Again, it is a matter of drawing a distinction. And probably we need to start putting a value tag on customer satisfaction. In most cases, however, mostly we see the opposite. We see things failing and we immediately can't help but noticing the insensitivity behind it. So the problem that inclusive design tries to combat is that a designed object, like a call center script or a sign-up form, is rejecting people. And the effect of this rejecting people is always the same. It generates a feeling of being left out. Here, obviously, we have an example of, I think it's a Native American trying to sign up for Facebook, and he receives the message, your name wasn't approved. What else is that than just another term for you are being rejected? And looking at it this way shows us that the problems that inclusive design tries to solve are really relationship problems. They are not problems of persons' capabilities or identities. They are not technical problems either. We all know people use services to get their stuff done. And this stuff relies on technology, but it is not sufficiently described in technological terms. Eric Meyer and Sarah Wachter-Böttcher suggest using the concept of stress cases, not merely speaking of the edge cases. Here is how they introduce the idea. Someone trying to shut down their account in a hurry is an edge case, as opposed to someone trying to shut down their account in a hurry is a stress case. Now, it's important to state that the use case is not simply people want to shut down their account, but people want to shut down their account in a hurry. It's their personal goal, motivation, and so on. They suffer from cognitive overload, possibly costing them 30 IQ points in the situation. And how the two authors are kind of introducing the whole concept of it, they say, the first phrase feels like we can ignore it for now. And we all know how for now becomes forever on a busy web table. The second, by contrast, feels urgent. It implies that the user has an important reason to act fast. That triggers our empathy and makes us want to help them, not ignore them. Let me briefly wrap up. Here are 8 key things for you to take away. Initially, we can only design for what we can imagine. We are not just creating design deliverables, we are shaping how we design along the way. Exclusivity in design makes people feel left out, and this creates stress of them. Inclusive design aims at reducing stress for people. And finally, inclusive design starts from recognizing exclusion in the design in order to overcome it. Here are 3 more bits of, well, practical advice for you, if you will. Our persona descriptions should always include the descriptions of the situations people find themselves in. And in order to understand exclusivity in a design, we can easily use the dimensions found in David Rock's SCARF model. Our designs need always to address people's sense of status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. SCARF, SCARF. And finally, last word, let us speak of stress cases, not of edge cases. Speaking of stress cases triggers empathy and the willingness to remedy a hurtful situation. And this is what we designers most care about. We care for people and we want to help them leading a better life. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michal, for that great presentation. I'm just going to tell everybody who's online right now that if you have any questions related to Michal's talk, please do throw them into the Q&A, and we'll get to those at the end of the talk, at the end of all 3 talks. And now I'm just going to introduce our next speaker, Malayaho. And she has, we are now bridging between, we'll be taking a look at how to keep our biases at bay. So the only way to step out of our experience is through user research, but even that has some pitfalls. Emma's our design director at Frantic, where she leads the development of design practice and culture. She helps organizations to adopt user-centric approaches to digital service development through service design methods. She has worked on large service redesigns as well as new service concepts, which often get started from ideas gained through user research. So I would love for Emma to take the stage and present her ideas on bias in user research.
Good morning, everyone. Yeah, I'm Emma. I'm design director here at Frantic, but also a service designer and a huge user research enthusiast, as Lisa mentioned. My background in design, though, is in graphic design and typography. So I start my talk with one of the most famous metaphors in typography, which is the crystal goblet. It was coined by Beatrice Ward, who argued in an essay by the same title that good typography should be as invisible and neutral as a clear glass goblet. So it should be something that doesn't distract the reader from the text content or give her any cognitive stress. To achieve this, she suggested we rely on conventions and rules for good typography. But is there such thing as neutral design? What would you say is the difference with these texts? Perhaps it's just the users and their different kind of contexts, which means what they are used to seeing. When we think of interaction, the most typical is human-to-human interaction. And with this kind of interaction, we tend to be quite forgiving. Even if the communication isn't very smooth, we understand we are all very different, and so we kind of let things go by. But when it comes to designing an interaction between a service and a human, or a user, as us digital designers tend to call them, we aim for clarity and neutrality, something that will serve all the users. So the universal design that was already mentioned here, something that would serve all the users. But however, I think it's actually lots of different interactions we are designing, like interactions as much as different users we have. Each of them interactions is unique, and sometimes they can be quite unsuccessful. Kat Holmes, in her wonderful book Mismatch, which Mihail already mentioned, she calls these unsuccessful interactions mismatches, and that's a good term in my opinion. So how we try to remedy these possible mismatches in digital service design, we pretty much rely on the principles of user-centered design, which means we aim to include the actual users of the service at every stage of the design process. So we include the users already from the initial research to find out their user needs. And we might invite them to co-design the actual service with us. And finally, of course, we try to test our designs carefully with the actual end users. Inclusive design as a principle aims at the exactly same thing. It is defined as a process and methodology where it's important to include those who otherwise wouldn't be in the actual design process. And here's another wonderful example. So Kat Holmes emphasizes that it's all about the process of a designer. Did they include the contributions from excluded communities? So all well and good in principle, right? Let's go do that research. But as we are human, we can still bring some unconscious bias to the research efforts. What should we keep in mind when we try to approach it with a more inclusive mindset? Well, first of all, we all need to be aware of our own bias. Like typographers, as designers, we rely on rules and conventions to make that neutral, universal design. In our toolkit, we have usability rules, accessibility guidelines, navigation conventions, and so on. However, we have to be aware that we are always influenced by also our own experiences on the services we use, on the apps and things we use daily. And we always have our own preference on design patterns. We also have design habits, and we are influenced by design trends, which you might notice perhaps like with navigation trends, which tend to change every couple of years. And also we have to remember we come very quickly blind to the thing we are designing. So if we are working on a project for hours and hours, we are very bad to judge it, as well the other team that is working on it. We also need to be aware that the users have their unique contexts. Just like us, the users have their experiences of the services they used previously, of the services they use daily. And based on that, they make assumptions on how the service we are designing will work. And we also need to be aware that they don't know how the functionalities work. We know it, but they don't. So they make assumptions and guesses based on history. Also, they are using the service for the first time and might get frustrated very quickly and abandon the service. And of course, we don't know what kind of stress case, as Mihail put it, they are in the middle of. We need to be aware of how we set up our research or testing groups. Typically, we set up research participants and testing groups based on the user groups we defined in the beginning of the process. So, for instance, users using the service for work purpose or on their free time, they might look for different things and might have different needs for the service. We try to create variability in our testing groups, for instance, with age and gender. When we recruit users, we might be able to use some customer panels if the company has that, and or we might do the recruiting through social media channels, or we might use our own networks. But with all of these methods, we create bias on active versus passive users. So the users we are recruiting are most likely those who are interested in developing the service, not the ones who are like most frustrated and reluctant to use it. So we need to keep that in mind. And also we need to always ask, who are we not asking from? When we create those user groups, does it really include everyone? We need to be aware of how artificial the testing situations can be. Quite often the testing environment we use might be this kind of lighted small room, and that's not a real life testing or a real life user environment. We need to be aware of also about the power dynamics we create when testing. So especially if we are testing the service we designed ourselves, we might unconsciously affect how the users are moving or stuff like that. It's also when testing or for doing interviews, it's important to use open questions. So it's very different to ask, how was using that service, or was it difficult using that service? And also we need to remember that in a testing situation, it's kind of a test. So as designers, we tend to want our design to succeed, and our test persons might want to do well in a test. One time I've had testers tell me that they actually looked at the service beforehand, so they would do better in a testing situation, and that's not what we are aiming for. We also need to be aware of the limitations of our testing results. So with testing, you uncover some of the problems, but never all of the problems. And that's something to keep in mind. So if we have limited amount of testers, let's say 10 to 20, we are not going to find everything that is wrong with our design. So more testing, we uncover more problems. For me, it typically looks like this, which is a good thing. So I might have assumptions on what will be the problem, and typically it's something else. Also, we need to be aware how we report the testing results. So only report what you found out and don't make too many assumptions on anecdotal evidence. If there's something that comes up that's really surprising, but you're not sure of, push for more testing. So to wrap up, be aware of your own bias, be aware of the user's unique context, be aware of how you set up research groups, think about who are you not asking from, be aware of how artificial testing situations can be, and can you counteract it? Can you go where the users are? And be aware of the limitations of testing results and how you report them. And remember, there is no such thing as neutral design. I leave you with this wonderful quote from Michael Kaufman. We all speak a different language. We are never able to communicate in some pure form that isn't being filtered to the complexity of our own definitions, individual experiences, and interpretations. But of course, it's still worth it to try and remedy some of the mismatched interactions we create. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma, for this lovely talk and for sharing your experiences with unconscious bias in the design process. I'm already seeing a few questions in the Q&A. If you have any questions for Emma, then please you can just add them during the next talk, even if you're thinking about it, or for Pia. Now I'll introduce Pia, who will be rounding off our trio of talks. She will be exploring language and the power that a designer can wield with the words that they choose. How can we keep our audience in mind when writing for user interfaces and ensure our content isn't shutting anyone out? Pia Jalonen is a content designer, UX writer, and current content lead at Frantic. She helps organizations find their voice and reach measurable goals with content. People are at the core of her design process with a special focus on usability and accessibility. Pia's background is in communications and linguistics, and she's fascinated by how people communicate with each other. So I'm gonna let Pia take the stage, and there you go.
Thank you, Lisa. Today, I will be talking about language in design and how we can create impactful designs with words. I am Pia Jalonen. My point of view today stems from my work in content design and from my background in languages and linguistics, and in particular sociolinguistics, which is the study of how societal and cultural context affects the language we use. Whether written or spoken or signed, we use language to communicate with others, and the language we use cannot be separated from the reality that we live in, from the society we live in, and the history that helped create it. Basically, it shapes the way we see the world and ourselves and each other. So the words we choose to use matter. They hold power over the way we see and shape the world around us, from our mundane daily interactions to how corporations and even governments communicate and share information. But before going into the details of language and interface design, we need to take a step back and reflect on what kind of language we speak ourselves. And I don't mean only whether you speak English or Finnish or any other language, but also the vernaculars and dialects you're familiar with, the jargon you come across at work or at your hobbies and wherever. So think about, how did you learn to communicate the way you do, and whose perspectives does it reflect? And then turning that around, whose point of view are you not familiar with? What kind of language are you not used to hearing? Are there ways your language could be excluding or even harming others? To uncover our own limitations and biases, we need to do the research. Michal and Emma just beautifully covered how to avoid exclusion and bias in design and research. So I will only emphasize the importance of understanding who your audience or your users are and how you are talking to and about them. In the context of digital design, UX writing falls under the wider umbrella of content design and strategy, with a special focus on writing the content that people see in user interfaces, from headings and buttons to forms and the error messages. the things that guide the user forward when they're using a website or an application. One way we can ensure that we remember that we're designing for other people rather than faceless software is to think of designing user experiences as conversations. So imagine that the service you're designing would be replaced with a face-to-face interaction with another human being. How would you get your message across and guide the user to complete the task they came to do? And bringing this thinking to inclusive design and especially content, I'll go over some practical aspects to consider when creating user experiences and how to remain aware of what kind of language you're using to get your message across. One important aspect is accessibility, which is designing and building our services in a way that anyone can use them, regardless of disability or situation or what device or software you're using. Accessible content comes down to rather simple things like structure and headings that are easy to skim and they're clearly marked, choosing readable fonts, and providing informative link text so you know where you're going, and including alternative text for images and having captioning and transcripts for videos. And these are just to name a few. Obviously, there are many other ways to create accessible content, but these are some of the basics. Accessibility of content is also about how well your users understand what is being said. It's making sure your content is at the appropriate reading level for your audience. It's avoiding jargon and acronyms, explaining complex concepts, and using possibly simpler words and sentence structures. And sometimes it might even be relevant to think about if you need to provide content or even rewrite some sections of your service in plain language. And this is, of course, a balancing act between clarity and keeping in touch with the brand's tone of voice. And the context is key here, understanding when you should be casual or formal, serious or funny, providing a lot of information or being very to the point. It's a good thing to play around with language, but it's important to be mindful when you're doing it, especially if you're trying to include things like jokes or very idiomatic expressions. They can be a very good stylistic choice in the right context. They can provide that special surprise element or feeling of delight, but they should never get in the way of the user understanding what they need to do and completing their task. And also, jokes and idioms in particular don't always translate well across cultures and languages. When you're working with a service that is localized and translated to different languages, make sure that the language you use is clear and it doesn't carry any hidden or double meanings or connotations. Or at least make sure that you provide the translators with enough context to help them get the right message and the right tone across. For the last couple of points, I want you to think about the kind of language you use when you're talking about other people. Gender is very pervasive in our language. There's no getting around that. In many languages, like French or Spanish, for example, it's part of the basic grammar, but it's also manifested in things like job titles and how we talk about our nuclear families. One thing to be wary of when you're writing is the so-called default male or generic masculine, which means using male nouns and pronouns to refer to groups of people that don't consist of only men, or even to refer to humanity in general. It's been shown that the default male is never read as neutral. And this is maybe something that crops up more in literature and journalism, but it's good to keep in mind in design as well. And when you hear or notice expressions like man hours or someone yells out, "Hey guys." But it's especially important to keep in mind when you're creating things like profile views or forms or surveys, which tends to lead you to group people in some way. When you're creating things like that, it's very important to stop and think, are you asking people to define or categorize themselves in ways that are unnecessary or even hurtful? If you must ask for someone's gender, are you only offering two choices, male and female? Could you ask about someone's spouse or partner rather than husband or wife? Could you ask about someone's parents rather than their mom and dad? Finally, in the context of especially healthcare and mental health services, it's essential to understand who you're designing for and how they wish to talk about themselves. Person-first language is recognizing that a person is first and foremost a person, not their substance abuse disorder or disability. For example, in aviation speak, it's common to hear something like a wheelchair is coming on board when you're actually referring to the person in that wheelchair, to the actual passenger, and that's not a very nice thing to say to a person. On the other hand, identity-first language recognizes that a person's disability or condition does not limit or reduce their life in any way, but rather is a key part of who they are. And this dichotomy tends to cause a lot of debate and is a highly personal choice that an individual or a community makes for themselves. So if you find yourself wondering what kind of language or terminology is appropriate or okay to use, do the research. Don't assume, don't make any assumptions, but rather talk to people. Ask and discuss with the people you're designing with and for to make sure that you're using the right kind of language for that context and for that situation, and people feel comfortable with that language. And today I'll leave you with this thought from the founder of the Wellbriety movement. If you want to care for something, you call it a flower. If you want to kill something, you call it a weed. Words matter, and you hold power over the word choices you make. Thank you.
Thank you, Pia. I really enjoyed that talk as well, and all three of the talks. I would like for us to all take a moment and maybe silently over there in your own little homes or workplaces, give a round of applause to Michal, Emma, and Pia for sharing such beautiful thoughts today. I think that we have gotten quite a few questions in the Q&A. I'll just there's been a few comments in the chat window as well. So I think that right now, what I would like to do is maybe just kind of reflect also on today we've been looking at inclusivity in design and how moving it can be. It's really about people. And I think that we went from the far realms of exclusion as a tool to be more inclusive with Michal's talk, to confronting our unconscious biases and how to weed them out of the design process with Emma. And lastly, to reflecting on how much we can affect change and the way people see themselves in our products and services with something too easily overlooked as the tone and diversity of the language that we choose to use when addressing our audience. I think that right now, what we can do is turn our attention to the audience with a Q&A session. We have gotten quite a few questions. I'm going to stop sharing so that we can look at those Q&As and comment on those. I think that I could ask all of the panelists to come online. Maybe you guys can put on your videos. We will be answering in turn. So of course, it's always, we'll probably be muted and then reopening our mics so that everybody can hear us. I just wanted to say that it's just lovely to see so many great questions. I think that we could start actually with a question to Michal here, and I'm going to we'll be answering this one live. So I'm going to read this out to you, Michal. And so Juha asks here that he says, Michal, I love the reframing of edge cases as stress case. That also was a comment by Anya in the chat. So quite true and quite transformative in the way one thinks about the problem at hand. How do I reduce the user's stress? And is a powerful design question to ask, but is seemingly not asked so often, as often as one might hope, or at the very least does not seem to be valued as highly as some other metrics by which products or services are measured. What do you think? Why do you think this is? So, hey, not an easy question, but maybe Michal, you want to start off, and if anybody else wants to chime in.
Gladly. Thank you. Well, yes, thank you, Johan. This is indeed, it is a brilliant question. It is one of the most difficult I could think of, but I give it a try nonetheless. Whenever we are conceiving or designing services, we are normally bound by certain restrictions. We either have limited budget, limited time, or limited technical capabilities. And so this very often tempts us to define the problem at hand as an engineering problem or as a technical problem. Now, with those things said, I don't mean to discredit any of the attempt to prevent scope creep, because we all know how that works. But if we turn it really around and think about it, how a user who's under stress, who is under pressure would use a system, or you would use anything that we built, then we see that the focus and the problem we are solving shifts completely. It's no longer about what we are able to build. It's about the question, does what we build really help? And I think that our, let's say, Western technology-focused way of looking at things often prevents us from looking at people when they're not at their best. So I believe, and I have, well, I'm guilty of that crime myself. When I wrote use cases, I often wrote them too simplistic and I was too simple with them. But I believe that having real people look at things and making them tell how they feel about seeing it and how they feel about using the system that you are building, that should help quite a bit.
Okay, I think that we can move on to the next question as well. And there was a question, and I think that I'll ask it again, and I'll ask of Michal, because you were the first speaker, and I'll let Pia and Emma maybe mull over some of the other Q&As, especially Pia just finished her talk. So there's a question, Michal, here about, you mentioned how high cognitive load lowers IQ points. Can you recommend a good read on this topic, or any kind of maybe some tips or something like that?
Yeah, well, the whole research on IQ has been basically in high fashion in the 70s and 80s and early 90s when I was at university.
When you were a young man.
there is a thing I recall from two American scientists. Rosenbaum is one name, I don't recall the other. I think the study even was conducted in 1973, and they took over 4,000 school kids to understand the impact of stress on the IQ. I think the New York Times wrote something about it in the 80s, but that is at the moment the best that I can come up with. Rosenbaum and Brown, I think Georgetown University, if I'm not, I just Googled it, I hope it is the right thing. That would be basically the gold standard, or basically the baseline read on that topic, yes.
Yeah, we can add that we were actually, to those who are in the audience right now, we were actually going to share some of the main references, like the ones that the speakers shared in their talks, and we could add maybe that one as well to the list, Michal, and at least the authors, and that would be maybe first point of reference where to start for those who are just starting their journey on the inclusive design, in inclusive design. So yes, so let's see. I think maybe this one might be a little bit towards Emma, but no pressure, Emma. I'm going to ask about the second question on the list here. Is how do you have any tool? Do you have any other tools how to notice your own biases? I think this is for all the speakers, but since Emma was bringing up bias, from my own point of view, I think that looking at my own biases, I went actually through one of Inklusiiv's workshops. And just not a plug on Inklusiiv, but it really did help. There's a lot of literature on how to on unconscious bias, but a workshop like that also tends to open up your eyes, and they have a lot of great tools and exercises that they use specifically to start thinking about your environment and who your friends are, and are you actually diverse in your thinking, and are you taking into account others? But Emma, do you have something maybe to add?
Well, that's a tough question, but I would say that in every design process, I notice biases and I'm challenged. One thing that came to mind with Lisa's example now is that I remember in some of the accessibility seminars, they have created these environments to simulate different kind of limitations, for instance, eyesight limitations. So you can experience services like a blind person, for instance.
Yeah, I think that there was this really famous, now I can't remember, I think it was Bekarra, I can't remember the, now just slipped out of my head, but the topic, that the quotes that I used at the beginning, that it is normal being different, is actually from a really famous study done. Let me just quickly poke my head there. Lang and Becerra, yeah, teaching universal design in Colombia. And there are these two approaches that were taken, and that was where they actually did a lot of exercises and work on making people who are architects and thinking and making them aware of how it feels to be a little bit different. And that difference wasn't only just sitting in a wheelchair getting into the building. It could have been exactly what Michal brought up. It could have been somebody temporarily disabled, meaning that they might be carrying their groceries or working with a small child, and they have their attention is taken over. So that was a really interesting paper to read. And from there, then I also have gleaned kind of like exercises of like sitting and just dumping out all the assumptions you have. And through those assumptions, you can then turn it around saying, I think that, yeah, there might be some bias here because I assume this of my users, or I assume this of my audience. So bringing out those assumptions can be also a way of maybe uncovering bias. So it's the first thing that we usually do and ask our stakeholders to do is like, what do you think of your users? And then usually those are the places where we're like, okay, so you assume this, and let's test it. Let's find out if that's true. And then also look for those edge in like the outside cases.
Yeah. And to cut out some of the process, of course, there's design tools, for instance, for simulating different kind of color things.
Yeah, color blindness and so on. Yeah, as well as then looking at the cognitive, and you have these. There are small exercises where you can you read this in 10 seconds? Is this really readable? Is this really approachable? Well, great. I think that if Michal, go ahead.
There's one more thing that comes to mind. We are very much used to thinking about cognitive biases as some sort of shortcomings in our brains. But in fact, what we're looking at is all these cognitive biases. They stem from our need for shortcutting our thinking. We don't have the time to do all the complex calculations. So we use rule of thumbs and we probably get it right, and we can't get it right in all cases. And so this is basically, I would recommend to have a look at the work that Gerd Gigerenzer did on topics of risk and uncertainty. Decision-making under risk and uncertainty or so is his general topic. And I think he has written a pretty recent book, Risk Savvy, that's the term. And there he jumps at length into the whole question of biases, how to recognize them, what do they serve us, what do they not let us do? Yes.
Great. Michal will probably either, if he has the chance, now we're discussing these things, but maybe we'll also add that to the list or if you have yeah, perfect. That's great. So yes, I could see paper wins always. So we're not able to chat in the chat as panelists as quickly as we'd like, but yeah, well, we'll be getting those out to you as well. I think that, yeah, I think that we can move on now. Let's see, there's some other, let me just quickly skim which one. Let's see, there's one for, how can we convey, okay, so I'd like to hear from Pia maybe. Then how can we convey our messages precisely when we, here, I'll just pick that one up, yeah. How can we convey our messages precisely when we create words to replace the normal words? For example, man has been used and understood in his way, in this way, based on etymology. Some words may not have a neutral word yet. So would you like to maybe answer or give your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Yeah, that is a great question. And I had that quote in there about how it definitely, we're using words like he and man to refer to humanity has in the past been the neutral way, but these days it has been proven that it is not. The way I try to see it is there is always some way around that. The easy way is maybe if you need to talk about a person, you can always say he or she, but even that to some people could feel exclusive. So the way I try to see it is, do you really need to use gender at all? Do you need to talk about a man or a woman, or can you just say person or human? Or can you refer to them with a title that doesn't designate any gender? Or if you're talking about families and familial ties and things like this, there's always usually a neutral term like parent rather than mother or father, or there's spouse rather than husband or wife. And child, of course, is also neutral. It's sometimes you do have to kind of jump through hoops to find the right term, but usually there is a way to then rewrite the whole sentence structure, maybe to then avoid using a term that is loaded with gender.
Yes, exactly. I think that was that last line is that you might have to rewrite things. You can't just plug and play. You can't just change man to bleh. You know, you can't just, it's not a fill in the blanks. It's a rethinking and also re-engineering your brain of like thinking of how to speak and being considerate. And it doesn't always pan out, but it definitely, I think that the second you start being considerate of this, you already are writing much better texts and much more inclusive texts. Well, thank you. And then I think there was a question here, which is really maybe a short one for you, is what is the best word to describe inclusive design in Finnish?
Yeah, the best word is probably more of a loan word from English, but we can always say inkluusio or inklusiivinen suunnittelu. I've also heard the term syrjimätön suunnittelu, which basically means non-exclusive design. There maybe isn't really a very common term for it yet, but I would say that inklusiivinen suunnittelu is the best way to go, at least for now.
Okay, thank you. I think that was that's something that probably should be a big discussion in Finland right now, is really getting that terminology and making it a normal term and making it not just a Finglish term that where you speak it in English in the middle of a Finnish sentence. So I think that it can be normalized into our vocabulary. I'm just quickly going through, there were a couple of direct questions or little comments. Katarina Staskau, to Michal, we are always talking about minimizing cognitive load. However, designing something difficult can protect the user. When making a task more difficult, you reduce the chance of an operator accidentally doing harm, thinking of garden buttons in an airplane cockpit, for example. So I think that if you want to, would you like to comment on that, or should we, how would you, yeah, Michal.
So basically, yes, there are certain things. If you think about operating heavy machinery, the controls for this require two hands. They're physically displaced from one another so that you can't have your hand in the machine, operate the machine at the same time, chopping off your hand. So this is, of course, perfectly reasonable and absolutely good to do. With most services we are thinking about at the moment, or with most of what we are concerned with at Frantic, we are talking about digital services. We are talking things that manifest themselves on screens. No hands are chopped off normally in what we're doing. And so therefore we are trying to, well, structure experiences rather than limiting them or basically making them too overwhelming. But you of course are perfectly right. Operators, and think of admin teams, think of call center agents who need to operate backend systems when people are calling and so on and so forth. This is an extremely important thing and is very, very often overlooked. And I believe that we need to look at these things more and need as well to understand those scripts that are handled in call centers, for example, they may do extreme harm and nobody is really much aware of it, at least not usually, except for those suffering from the responses.
Thank you. I think that there was, let's see, I'm just checking now real quick here. Okay, so Pia Juha is asking, how do you convince, let me click that one on. How do you convince someone else to change their wording, for example, on a product user interface? If the same words can be perceived differently by different people, how does one find what's objectively best in the use of language when the betterness seems to depend at least partially on the individual's perception of those words? What facts do you reach for when engaged in such a debate with someone? Not an easy question. These are great questions, by the way. I just wanted to say that you guys are awake. It is 9:03 a.m. in Finland, at least. For those who are maybe not in the same time zone, it was an early morning for us. So, Pia, do you have something maybe you want to share?
Yes. So, yeah, to start with, I believe that there is never anything objective when it comes to language. Language can never be completely objective. It's always subjective. It's always about opinions. But when I get into these, I feel like the first thing is testing. So you really need to at least take around the office or wherever you are and ask different people how they understand a specific term, and then kind of work on that. Like, is there a common ground we could find? Or then obviously even like conducting user research and making testing language a part of user testing. And when you're testing user flows, you're also asking people about how they understand different kinds of terms and pinpointing when you realize that people are either misunderstanding something or they're finding something even like harmful or offensive. And then I can also go full on linguistics nerd and then look at the etymology of words and the history of words, where they came from, looking at studies and then finding ways there to then make someone understand that, okay, this is not an okay word to use, and having the arguments from there. Like, one example I've seen going around the internet lately is sayings like no can do or long time no see, which might be a fun thing to add to an app when you haven't used it for a while. But the reality is that their origin is kind of shady. It comes from making fun of a certain kind of pidgin English in the States, of the way some Chinese immigrants have communicated with the community around them. And saying no can do or long time no see is kind of laughing at the simplified language that is pidgin English. That's an actual language that people use to communicate. So then when you uncover these kind of things, then it's much easier to explain that, okay, this is a fun thing to say, but let's use something else that doesn't have any kind of heavy baggage that comes along with it.
Yeah, this is a great point. I mean, I think that it's humor is so it's a very, very fine line, and what is really humorous in the end, and something that's an inside joke should stay an inside joke, in my opinion. And also those kind of things that there are these I mean, this is a very strange but very funny anecdote that I thought was during this there's this knitting store and that I follow online, and they're used to be called the Mason-Dixon Knitting Club. And Mason-Dixon line is really like from like the American slavery, and it's all related to that. It is an area, of course, but these persons like decided to change their name in that way, that they stopped referring them to themselves. Just in the past few months, they made a point of stating that they are not affiliated with that, and that they don't want to be affiliated. They were just in an area, and it came to them as like, okay, let's call ourselves this. And they were for years called this Mason-Dixon Knitting. And then this became like MDK, and they changed like the wording just to become more inclusive and to really take into account and accountability of like what the history is of that area, and not to belittle it, and not to, and really it's a small thing, but these kind of changes where you really are considerate going, this is not okay. And making fun of someone's language without knowing that you're making fun of their language is really, it's very interesting. Actually, in the chat, there is the long time no see, Ming Un Anderson says that it's a direct translation of a Chinese saying, And yep, that may be so, and that is probably true. But the way it's used, especially in North America, it might also have connotations of racist or a bigotry. And I think that's the thing where you want, maybe you don't need to use that in a general user interface. And maybe when you're speaking colloquially or in with other persons, they might understand that you are not speaking about this. So yeah, this is a really great question. Thank you again. I'm just gonna click done on that one. And then here, let's see. We have one to all the speakers. How would you promote, let me just click that on. How would you promote inclusive design in company culture? Where to start? Oh, this is another question for Inklusiiv. Bikash, if you are online, you might want to even take this. Like, I don't know, but we are as designers, I think personally, from my own point of view, I think that inclusiveness starts with really looking at your unconscious bias, working and making the work about the end users and really widening the scope. Thinking of inclusive design, like I brought up with the triangle model, that the ableists are not at the top of the rung, that they are the base and the foundation, but we have to work towards a more inclusive, like, population thinking. And I think that maybe there are great workshops that you can have your company go to, and I think that Inklusiiv has some of those. I don't know if Bikash is willing or wants to answer this, but that's something that might be actually in his purview, because we have also turned to Inklusiiv to help us be more inclusive in our work as well. So would you like to answer, Bikash, if you're able to? I don't know, I'm not sure if he's, yes, great, thank you. I didn't want to put you on the spot, but I thought this is a really perfect question for you guys.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. Thank you for the question. And I definitely understand that, for company culture, that people do have to understand the basic understanding of what D&I is all about. So kind of like providing the company like different workshops and different trainings and different sessions about the basic understanding of D&I, understanding of what unconscious biasness is all within the company culture, and also kind of like providing certain trainings and certain kind of like workshop related to like anti-racism, for example, privilege, what kind of privilege each of the team members have, and how to kind of like be inclusive within the community, within the working community. So that is pretty much what I think, that where you can start. So at least having a basic understanding of what diversity and inclusion is all about, and how do you kind of like within the company culture, how do you see as a whole, and how do you kind of understand, or let's say kind of think and kind of talk with each of the employees that you have. So overall, the basic understanding of D&I is the priority, I would say.
Yeah, I think that when you're really starting that off and you really want to open that discussion, you have to start there at the basics and really like defining what is diversity inclusion, what does it mean, how are you taking it into account in the way you recruit, the way the teams are created, who are working on the products and services. As consultants, we're brought into teams, and we can affect change in terms of from the bottom up, maybe, and or from the sides, laterally. But I think that the companies that we work for and work with, we can bring some of our knowledge, but then that company itself has to be pushing and making a priority to be thinking inclusively, and exactly that. And also maybe what Michal brought earlier is really looking at like, how are they being exclusive? So really confronting the fact that there is difference, and difference is okay, difference is good, but then looking at it from the point of view of like, are you making a conscious effort to exclude somebody? Are your target users, have you decided, do you have an ableist view of the world? These are all just really important questions. Once you just start asking those questions, you're already at a couple of 3, 4, 5 steps ahead of other companies who may not even be asking this, who may not understand that they're privileged. And as designers, we're in between. We're kind of like trying to we're humans and we have our own biases, We don't want to be imposing them, but we also want to be asking those tough questions of the teams that we're working with. So when you're working in concept or service design, you are asking, like, who are we making this for? Really, who are we making this for? Are we making it for individuals, or are we making it for an average person, perfect, has everything going on? Who does that? I want to know that person, because I am not that person. And I don't think any of us are designers think that we're the perfect example. So we're not our users, and we are at the same time. So yeah, I think that if anybody else wants to chime in on that one. If not, we can go forward. I think we have some few other questions still. Yes, hey, Katarina has one, and I think we can throw that one in to all. What if inclusivity is being seen as an edge case? And I think that sort of relates to what we just talked about, but I think that all of us are, okay, I'm also nodding. So who would like to jump in? I don't need to be in the, yeah.
Yeah, I can go first. This ties to the question before. I was thinking that in terms of how to promote inclusive design process in a company, or make it a requirement, I would say very well, one thing is bring out the statistics. Lisa had that in the beginning, that we all have some limitations, so it's not an edge case. Another thing is including everyone of the team in the process when you are doing user participation. So it's not a designer issue, like it quite often it becomes designer's job, but include also the developers, the product owners. And if the client pushes back, then one way is to just make it a requirement. For instance, I had a client project where the client was asking, like, when is the design ready? When can we put it into the production? And I said that when we have tested it. So making it a requirement, the user participation.
Yes, I think Mihal's had something to say now, yeah?
Yeah, this is basically, I don't know where I've seen it. I've seen it on the internet somewhere. There was the discussion whether an office building should get a ramp so that people in wheelchairs could access the building. And then basically the argument went like this: well, only 3% of our customers are actually sitting in a wheelchair. Now, basically, this sounds like just arithmetic, statistics, or something else. But basically, as designers, or as anybody involved with the question of inclusivity, exclusivity, you can always turn it into a phrase. Say, are you saying that these 3% of our customers don't matter for our business? In most cases, exclusivity is not mean, or it's not being inconsiderate. It's just so that we need to, in order to get things done, we need to scope them so that we make sure that we have a middle of the road or mainstream design tackled first. And then this is where the whole talk about edge cases really originally came from. Is it included or excluded in our scoping? And then basically, as I said before, exclusivity happens, needs to be recognized in order to be overcome. And so therefore telling the stakeholders that are thinking about it, that no matter what we come up with, we may not be able to solve all the problems right now. We have constraints in budget, timeline, building regulations, whatever it might be. But saying that just because we decide to exclude it right now, this doesn't mean that we're over and done with talking about it. And this is how I would make sure, or how I would try to reintroduce the idea of further iteration through the back door into a later stage of the discussion, if by all means possible.
Thank you. I think that now we are rounding in on the last few questions. If you still have a question, you can throw it in there and we'll try to get to it. There's a couple of here. Let's see. Do you have a framework on how to take all the different aspects of inclusivity into account when designing, and how do you prioritize between all the various topics? So basically, do we have a checklist? Does anyone want to tackle this one? I mean, maybe this is sort of pushing the accessibility checklist, and that's and of course, like as I see the nodding, that accessibility is a really, it's sort of hand in hand, especially with digital services. But it's sort of like when you're already building, it's kind of like okay, let's double check that the code is let's say readable by a special device. But I think that inclusive design especially is the step before that, and really looking at, are you testing, are you talking to the end users, are you finding those stress cases, and are you looking at outliers as really part of the group and not saying, oh, those are the three, exactly like that, that's the 3% that don't matter. And you're like, wait a minute, hey, maybe we should rethink that. And I think it's at the beginning when you're framing, and even in the middle of a project, when you're reframing and reframing and reframing, you're looking at your process, you're reprocessing your process, you're looking at this, is everybody involved? Are there questions now being asked by, let's say, developers who may not have been part of this conceptual phase because at scale, an enterprise, you can't have everybody. But if somebody hasn't been there, can they be can we have that discussion? Just that double check that is everybody on board. That is sort of where you start asking, are we being inclusive, and making sure that we all have the same mindset, I think is one of the ideas. And the accessibility checklists help to some extent, but being inclusive really in terms of like the concept, are we giving is our target group the right target group? Are we solving for the right question and not just solving the problem correctly? And that's what I think that it's really difficult. I don't know per se, maybe somebody else has an answer of a specific framework. I think it's a bit of a hodgepodge, maybe a quilt of different tools that I use, from service design, from UX design, from that background, from these kind of behavioral sciences. We started looking at like psychology. So this is a very, very difficult question. I don't know if I can answer it in that like little frame in this moment. But Michal, do you have something you want to say?
I really, I have to admit, I was looking it up just a couple of minutes ago, because I remember having seen something that I would consider a reasonable framework, a reasonable point to start from. I don't know whether I'm pronouncing this right, Paciello Group. They have set up a list of the inclusive design principles, which I think is a very valid starting point. Because if you think about, I'm just watching the chat, and now the topic of the wheelchair ramp has risen. Two very interesting contributions from the audience. One saying, oh, brilliant, if you give it a wheelchair ramp, this means that everybody with a pram, with a push chair, can as well access the building. That's a good thing. And somebody else said, not to speak of all the other people with mobility issues. And here we see how inclusive design really works. It's an iterative design process. You have a starting point, and by including more feedback, you always get it, oh, this is true as well. Oh, this is true as well. Oh, we have solved this problem as well. And this is basically how it ideally would work. So it isn't less, or it is not so much a checklist of things to take care of. It is about setting the stage for having a constructive and open discussion about, oh, wow, look, this is what we can achieve with only this much additional effort. And then we can kind of put it down so that we know, put it down in a list so that we know that, yes, here are still things we need to address in the future. So Paciello Group will include it in the list of references, inclusive design principles. That should be a helpful start at least.
Actually, an anecdote, when I worked for HSL, our local Helsinki area public transportation, when the design of the new tram, the speed tram that's going across the city, when this design was started, I was part of a group of experts, panelists in that, and was in a couple of workshops done by a company, maybe you know Hellon, who I was working with in partnership with them, and they were actually took the stance of if we take the family with small children as the main group of users, we will tackle wheelchair access. So they actually didn't go disability wheelchair, but they went and they said, and they put it on their head and they said, what if we do it? We will talk about families and children, and everybody's, then all of a sudden there was a big uproar of even in this panel of experts and different people around the city. Then they said, well, I don't have children, so I don't know how to empathize. And it was so funny that the first thing was like, I don't know anything about children. So how am I supposed to design for them? And then I started thinking exactly that, the open discussion of, we don't know, we aren't our users, and we need to maybe do contextual inquiry, follow the users, watch people, not stalk them, of course, that's not what I said. I didn't mean follow your users without them knowing, but I mean, just taking into account that your target can be something very different and very uncomfortable for some people, and that will encompass a larger group, and so help solve for a problem that maybe didn't know. So then everything had to be lowered, like all the handrails weren't high, they were lower. And if you lower the handrail for a child, then who to hang on to, you've lowered it for, let's say, for persons who may have maybe moving around with some sort of device, a cane and so on, older persons who may be hunched over. And this kind of thinking, then it all of a sudden, it opened up a world of possibilities for the universal design. And that group was no longer the able-bodied white male. It was a family, and there were more than just one person in the group. And there was all of a sudden, there were two persons, there was a single person with two children. And that made it very interesting. And this whole cognitive overload and so on started coming in. So if you really frame the problem a little bit differently, or the challenge, that could be one way. Now we're rounding in on the end of our session time. I think there would be one more question here for Pia and probably any others, but it says, thanks for your great speech. Time and time again, we see that in various sectors, we do not speak the same language as policymakers, designers, leaders, activists, academics to reach issue on inclusion, attraction and representation. Is there a way to build this awareness that will push for more focus on who do we hire and include to make sure communication and language is an integral part of project success? Do you want to maybe give a couple of words on that? And I think that might have to be our last question. This has been a great discussion, but Pia?
Yes, that is a really good question and not an easy question. It's hard to get people on the same page with you. I think it starts with you yourself realizing that everyone's point of view is limited. You can never understand what's going on in other people's heads and what their experience of the world is. So kind of trying to get your team into that mindset of, we can't speak for others and we can't design for a worldview that we don't know. So like Emma described in the user research process of finding the people to bring their views into that research process. And then, I don't know, maybe looking at who is in our team and who is not in our team. So mapping out the points of view that we do know and what we don't know, and then bringing that to when we're talking about content design, then thinking about what are basically the core messages we need to get out, not thinking about tone or not thinking about terminology, but just thinking like, what are the things we want to say, whether it's in government or academia or design or policy, and then bringing that to the next level of creating a message architecture of just listing out the things you want to say and kind of the tone you want to use to say those things. And then again, bringing that forward to then designing an experience around what the context is. So the same message can be conveyed in many different ways for different people and different audiences. So finding the right the right level of complexity for the message you're conveying for different types of people and different communities that live in different contexts. But yeah, this is a hard one, but basically just trying to realize that you can't. There was another question earlier about can we over include, or is there over inclusion? So I would say that kind of related to this, that there is a big difference between designing for all and inclusive design. We can never, or designing for all is a really tricky way to start designing. There was in Kat Holmes' Mismatch book, there's this concept of not designing designing for one and extending to many rather than designing for many and then bringing that to one person. So when we're really designing for the edge cases or really the stress cases, then we can ensure that we're really designing for everyone rather than trying to solve a problem for everyone when you usually end up not solving a problem for anyone. Yeah,
Thanks.
I don't know if anyone else wants to pitch in.
No, I'm so sorry. I have to be the bad guy. And there seems to be a lot of thank yous, and those were really useful. So I think that what we'll do is we'll wrap up right now, and I will just let's see, talk about really quickly about what's coming next. And I think that we can thank all the let's see, we can thank all the lovely speakers. And what's next now is I think that we at Frantic have a wide pool of experts, not only in design. We've been talking about inclusivity in design today, but we also have tech and agile leadership. Inclusivity and creating accessible services is part of everything we do. And I think that if your organization needs a boost with digital service development, you can just drop us a line at sales@frantic.com and we'll get back to you. I would really love to thank you all for joining in today. It has been a pleasure being a host of this lovely event. It really took a lot of work from our side, and I think that I would really love a round of applause for all of our awesome speakers. And I thank you on my behalf and the audience because they can't be standing in ovation at this great discussion that was held today. I think that in the chat there are a few thank yous, and we really appreciate you getting up so early, all of you, and being part of this this amazing little adventure we had this morning. Please stay tuned to more Inklusiiv Breakfast Clubs, and I think that's a wrap from our side. So thank you.